Samuel was a quiet man. He did not talk much, and he did not need much. He had his kitchen, his pots, his early mornings, and his cup of tea. That was enough for him. That had always been enough. He worked as a cook at a small human outpost that sat at the edge of a wide alien forest. The outpost was not a famous place. It did not appear on any important maps. It was just a collection of low buildings, a few communication towers, some storage units, and about 30 people who needed to be fed 3 times a day. Samuel fed them all. He had been doing it for years, and he was good at it. The forest behind the outpost was something else entirely. It was old. The trees were tall and silver-barked, with leaves that caught the light in strange ways and turned it into colors that did not have names in any human language. The researchers at the outpost studied the forest carefully. They kept their distance from it too. Everyone did. Not because it was dangerous, exactly, but because it was unknown, and unknown things deserve a certain kind of respect. Samuel respected it from his kitchen window every morning. He liked the early hours before anyone else was awake. The outpost was silent then. The machines were quiet. The radios were off. There was only the sound of the wind moving through the silver trees and the soft hiss of the kettle on the stove. Samuel would make his tea, open the back door of the kitchen, and stand there looking at the tree line while the world slowly woke up around him. It was his time. His quiet. He guarded it without making a fuss about it. On this particular morning, he opened the back door the same way he always did. He stepped out onto the flat stone step, lifted his cup, and looked toward the trees. And he stopped. There was something on his step. It was small. It was very still. And it was looking directly at him with a pair of amber eyes that caught the pale morning light like 2 warm coins. Samuel had heard about drakes from the researchers. Everyone at the outpost had. They were creatures that lived deep in the forest. Intelligent, the researchers believed, though no one had ever managed to sit down with one long enough to find out how intelligent. They looked like small dragons, roughly speaking. Scaled bodies, folded wings, long tails. They moved quickly between the trees and were rarely seen up close. Most people at the outpost had only ever caught a glimpse of one from a distance, and even that was considered lucky. This one was sitting on his back step. It was tiny. No bigger than a house cat, maybe smaller. Its scales were pale green, the kind of green that reminded Samuel of new leaves in spring back on Earth. Its wings were folded neatly against its sides. Its tail was curled around its own small feet, like it was trying to take up as little space as possible. It looked young. Not a baby, but young. And it was holding something. In its 2 front claws, held carefully and deliberately, was a bundle of fresh greens. Dark-leafed, clean, beautifully picked. Samuel recognized the type immediately. They grew near the clean streams deeper in the forest, far from the outpost, in places no one from the settlement ever went. He had asked the researchers about sourcing them before. They had told him it was not practical. Too far, too difficult, too uncertain. But here they were. On his step. In the claws of a tiny creature that had apparently walked out of the forest alone to bring them to him. Samuel did not move. The drake did not move either. They looked at each other for what felt like a long time. The morning air moved between them, cool and quiet. A bird, or something like a bird, called once from somewhere in the trees and then went silent. Then the drake stepped forward. It moved slowly, carefully, the way a small creature moves when it is not sure if it is safe but has decided to try anyway. It walked right up to Samuel's feet, set the bundle of greens down on the stone step with great care, and stepped back. It looked up at him. Samuel looked down at the greens. They were perfect. Not crushed, not torn. Each stem was intact. The leaves were still holding their moisture. Someone had taken real time and real care picking these, choosing only the best ones, making sure they arrived undamaged. He looked back at the drake. The drake's amber eyes were wet at the edges. That was the first thing Samuel really noticed, not the scales, not the wings, not the strangeness of the moment, but the wetness at the corners of those eyes. He had seen that look before. Not on creatures like this, but on people. On people sitting alone in his kitchen late at night, not saying anything, just sitting there because they did not know what else to do. He knew that look very well. The drake made a sound. It was soft and low and uneven, like something trying to hold itself together and not quite managing it. Then it did something that made Samuel's chest go tight in a way he had not expected. It pressed one small claw flat against its own chest. Then it turned and pointed, clearly, deliberately, without any hesitation, toward the dark line of trees at the edge of the forest. Samuel followed the direction of that tiny pointing claw. He looked at the trees. He looked back at the drake. The drake was still pointing. Still looking at him. Still making that soft, broken sound. Samuel set his tea down on the step. He crouched slowly, getting down to the level of the small creature so that he was not looming over it. The drake did not flinch. It watched him come down to its level and it held its ground, which told Samuel something about how desperate it was. A frightened creature runs. A desperate one stays. He held out one hand, palm up, open and empty. The drake looked at his hand. Then it looked at his face. Then, very slowly, it stepped forward and placed one small claw into his palm. It was lighter than he expected. Warm, the way something alive is always warm. Samuel nodded once. He stood up, went back inside, and came out 30 seconds later with his old field kit from the hook beside the door. He pulled on his coat. He picked up his walking boots from beside the step and put them on without rushing. He did not leave a note. He did not tell anyone where he was going. He simply got ready, the way he always got ready when there was a job to do. The drake watched every movement with those wet amber eyes. When Samuel was ready, he looked down at the tiny creature and said, quietly and simply, "All right. Show me." The drake turned at once and moved toward the trees, quick and certain, pausing every few steps to look back over its shoulder. Samuel followed it into the forest without another word. The forest was nothing like Samuel had imagined. He had looked at it from his kitchen window every morning for 3 years. He had watched the light move through the silver trees and thought he understood something about it. He did not. Standing inside it was completely different from looking at it from a distance. The trees were taller up close. The air was cooler and heavier, with a smell like wet stone and something sweet underneath it that he could not name. The ground was soft beneath his boots, covered in a thick layer of something that was not quite moss but behaved like it, springing back slowly after each step as if the forest was breathing. Samuel walked carefully and paid attention. The tiny drake moved ahead of him through the trees. It was fast for its size, covering ground in quick, light movements, its pale green scales catching flickers of the morning light that filtered down through the canopy above. Every few steps it would stop, turn its small head, and look back at Samuel with those amber eyes. Checking. Making sure he was still there. When it saw that he was, it turned forward again and kept moving. Samuel kept up as best he could. He was not a young man. His knees reminded him of that on cold mornings. But he was steady, and he was used to being on his feet for long hours, and he knew how to move at a pace he could maintain. He watched the ground, watched the roots that crossed the path, and watched the drake ahead of him so he would not lose sight of it in the strange silver light. After a while, he began to notice things. The forest was not silent. It had its own sounds, not loud ones, but constant ones. Things moved in the high branches above him. The wind touched the leaves and made a sound that was almost like voices, low and overlapping, never quite forming into words. Once, something large passed through the trees far to his left, moving parallel to him for a short time before disappearing deeper into the forest. He could not see it clearly. He did not try to follow it. He kept his eyes on the drake. The drake, for its part, seemed to know exactly where it was going. There was no hesitation in it. No circling, no doubling back. It moved with the certainty of a creature that had made this same journey many times before. Samuel found that reassuring. Whatever was waiting at the end of this walk, the drake knew the way there and back. That was something. About 20 minutes in, the drake stopped. It stopped so suddenly that Samuel almost walked past it. He caught himself and stood still. The drake was crouched low to the ground, completely motionless, its eyes fixed on something to the right. Samuel looked. He could not see anything unusual, just more trees, more soft ground, a patch of pale light coming down through a gap in the canopy. Then he heard it. A sound. Low and rhythmic, coming from somewhere nearby. Not mechanical. Not human. Something alive, breathing slowly, heavily, unevenly. The kind of breathing that did not sound right. The drake turned and looked at him. Then it did something unexpected. It lifted one small claw and pressed it flat against its own chest, the same gesture it had made back at the kitchen door. Then it pointed to the right, toward the sound. Then it pressed the claw to its chest again. Samuel understood. Or he thought he did. Someone the drake cared about was over there. Something important. Something that belonged to it. He nodded slowly. The drake watched his nod for a moment, as if deciding whether a nod meant what it hoped it meant. Then it turned and led him to the right, moving more slowly now, more carefully, as if it did not want to make too much noise. They pushed through a narrow gap between two close-growing trees, and Samuel found himself in a small clearing. It was quieter here. The canopy above was thicker, and the light that came through was dim and green-tinged. The ground was soft and damp. In the center of the clearing, there was a hollow, a wide, low space at the base of a massive old tree, where the roots had grown up and around each other over many years and created something like a natural shelter. Inside the hollow was a drake. A large one. Samuel stopped walking. The creature inside the hollow was nothing like the small one beside him. It was easily the size of a large dog, maybe larger. Its scales were a deeper green, darker and duller than the little ones, and that dullness was wrong. Samuel could sense that immediately, the way you sense when a color is off, when something that should be bright is not. Its wings were half open and loose against the ground, not folded neatly the way a resting creature folds them. Its eyes were closed. Its chest was rising and falling, but the rhythm was uneven and labored, and with each breath came that low, rattling sound Samuel had heard from the trees. The tiny drake ran to it immediately. It pressed itself against the large one's side, looked back at Samuel, and made a sound that was different from any sound it had made before. Not desperate this time. Something quieter than that. Something that sounded, to Samuel's ears, like a child sitting beside a parent's bed and not knowing what else to do except stay close. Samuel stood at the edge of the hollow for a moment. He was a cook. He was not a doctor. He was not a researcher or a field medic or a wildlife expert. He was a man who had spent his life feeding people, which meant he had spent his life paying attention to living things, what they needed, what was missing, what was wrong. He crouched down and looked at the large drake carefully. He looked at the dull scales. He looked at the loose wings. He looked at the uneven rise and fall of that broad chest. He looked at the ground around the hollow, the damp soil, the mineral-streaked stones near the base of the roots, the faint shimmer of a narrow stream visible through the trees not far away. He had seen something like this before. Not in a creature like this, but in people. Years ago, at a remote outpost on a different world, 2 of the supply workers had gotten sick from a stream that ran through heavy mineral deposits in the rock beneath the ground. The water had looked clean. It had tasted clean. But it had been slowly poisoning them, and the signs had looked exactly like this: the dullness, the heavy breathing, the strange looseness in the body. Samuel opened his field kit. The tiny drake watched him from its spot beside the large one. It did not move away. It did not make a sound. It simply watched, with those wet amber eyes, as Samuel began to look through what he had brought with him. He did not have everything he needed. But he had enough to start. He looked at the little drake and said quietly, "I need you to stay calm. I am going to help." The drake could not understand his words. But it stayed exactly where it was, watching him, and it did not make another sound. That was enough. Samuel got to work. Samuel had learned a long time ago that panic was useless. It felt like doing something. It looked like doing something. But it was not doing something. It was just noise inside your head that got in the way of the actual work. And right now, there was actual work to do. He set his field kit open on the ground beside him and looked through it carefully. He had packed it years ago and added to it slowly over time, the way a careful person builds anything. A little at a time, always thinking about what might be needed next. There were clean cloths, folded small. A sealed container of water from the outpost supply. Several small pouches of dried herbs that he used in his cooking but that had other uses too, if you knew what you were doing. A short blade. A metal cup. A box of fire starters. Some cord. A few other small things that had seemed worth carrying and had never been removed. He looked at the large drake again. Up close, it was even more concerning than it had been from the edge of the clearing. The scales along its neck and sides had lost their sheen entirely. There was a grayish quality to them that should not have been there. Its breathing was slow and uneven, 3 or 4 shallow breaths, then a longer one, then a pause that lasted just a little too long before the cycle started again. Its front legs were stretched out in front of it loosely, not tucked beneath it the way a resting creature would hold them. Its tail lay flat and still. It was not resting. It was failing. Samuel moved slowly and without sudden movements. He did not know how the large drake would react to a human being this close, even in its weakened state. A frightened animal in pain was unpredictable, and an animal this size could cause serious damage without meaning to. He kept his movements calm and deliberate, the way he moved in his kitchen when things were going wrong and speed would only make them worse. The tiny drake stayed pressed against its parent's side the whole time. It watched Samuel with those amber eyes and it did not growl or snap or make any sound of warning. That told him something. The small one had chosen to trust him. It was telling the large one, in whatever way drakes communicated these things, that this human was not a threat. Samuel crouched beside the large drake's head. He looked at its mouth first. The lips, if you could call them that, were dry and slightly discolored, darker than they should have been. He looked at the eyes, which were closed but moving slightly beneath the lids, which meant it was still aware on some level, still somewhere inside itself. He pressed 2 careful fingers against the side of its neck, below the jaw, and felt the pulse. It was there. Slow, but steady in its own uneven way. Then he looked at the stream. It was narrow, barely wider than his arm, and it ran quietly through the trees about 15 steps from the hollow. The water looked clear. It moved cleanly over the rocks in its bed. But Samuel stood up, walked over to it, and crouched beside it, and looked more carefully. The rocks were the problem. He could see it clearly now that he was close. The stones at the bottom of the stream had a particular kind of discoloration, a pale, chalky coating on some, a reddish-brown stain on others. He had seen that combination before. It meant minerals. Specific ones that dissolved into water slowly and built up in a body over days and weeks until the body could no longer manage them. It was not a fast poison. It was a quiet one. The kind that crept in while you were not paying attention. The large drake had likely been drinking from this stream for some time. Samuel went back to the hollow. He thought about what he had. He thought about what the tiny drake had brought him, the bundle of fresh greens, still sitting in his kit bag where he had placed them carefully before leaving the outpost. He had not understood at the time why the small creature had chosen those particular greens as its gift. He understood now. Those greens grew near clean water. They were full of things that helped the body clear itself. He had known that from his cooking, from years of working with ingredients and understanding what they did. Eaten raw and prepared correctly, they could help move contamination through a body and give it something clean to work with. They were not a cure on their own. But they were a start, and they were exactly what the drake needed alongside everything else he was planning. The tiny creature had not brought those greens as a simple gift. It had brought them because it somehow knew they were needed. Samuel sat still for a moment with that thought. Then he let it go and got back to work, because thinking about it would not help the large drake breathe any easier. He built a small, careful fire a short distance from the hollow, far enough not to frighten the drakes but close enough to be useful. He set his metal cup over it and filled it with clean water from his sealed container. While it heated, he prepared the greens, tearing them carefully, combining them with 2 of the dried herbs from his pouches, the ones he knew were safe and gentle and effective for this kind of problem. He worked quietly and methodically, the way he always worked, each step following the last without hurry. The tiny drake watched him the entire time. At one point it stood up, walked over to him, sniffed the cup carefully, and then walked back to its parent and pressed close against it again. Samuel took that as a good sign, though he could not have said exactly why. When the mixture was ready, he let it cool slightly so it was warm but not hot. Then he brought it carefully to the large drake's side. This was the difficult part. He needed the creature to take it, and he could not explain what it was or why it was needed or ask permission. All he could do was offer it and hope. He held the cup close to the large drake's mouth. Nothing happened for a moment. Then the tiny drake made a sound, short and soft and specific, directed clearly at its parent. A sound that Samuel could not translate but that carried something unmistakable in its tone. Something like "Trust me." The large drake's nostrils moved. It was smelling the mixture. Another long moment passed. Then, slowly, the large drake's mouth opened just enough, and it took the first small amount of the mixture. Samuel stayed completely still, barely breathing, as it swallowed. Then he offered a little more. It took that too. He worked slowly for the next hour, small amounts at a time, letting the large drake rest between each one. He wiped its scales gently with a damp cloth. He kept the fire going at a steady, quiet level. He talked to the drakes in a low, even voice, not because they could understand him, but because silence felt wrong, and a calm voice was better than nothing. The tiny drake never moved from its parent's side. By the time the morning had fully arrived and the forest light had shifted from pale gray to something warmer, the large drake's breathing had changed. It was still slow. But the rattle in it was smaller than before. Samuel refilled the cup and started again. He was not finished yet. But he was not worried anymore either. He knew which direction this was going. The forest grew dark slowly. Samuel had not planned to stay through the night. He had not planned any of this, if he was honest. He had opened his back door for his morning tea and somehow ended up deep inside an alien forest, crouched beside a sick creature the size of a large dog, with a tiny drake watching his every move from 2 feet away. Life had a way of taking you places you had not booked a ticket for. He checked his supplies. He had enough clean water for several more rounds of the mixture. The greens the tiny drake had brought were holding up well. He had kept them wrapped in one of his clean cloths to preserve their moisture. He had 2 more pouches of herbs that were useful. The fire was small and steady. The metal cup was doing its job. He had enough to work through the night if he needed to, and it was becoming clear that he would need to. He settled in. The large drake had taken 4 small amounts of the mixture through the morning and into the afternoon. Each time, Samuel had waited, watched, and then offered more when he felt the time was right. He was going by instinct as much as anything else. He had no textbook for this. He had no chart to follow. He had only years of paying close attention to living things and a deep, quiet certainty that the approach was right. The large drake had not opened its eyes yet. But it had shifted once. A slow, heavy movement, repositioning itself slightly inside the hollow, which meant it had the strength to move, which was better than before. Its wings had drawn in a little closer to its body, which Samuel took as a sign that some awareness was returning. A creature that was truly failing did not make small adjustments. A creature that was fighting its way back did. He kept going. The tiny drake did not sleep. Samuel had expected it to, at some point. It was a small creature and it had clearly been under enormous strain. It had gone out alone, found a human, communicated something extraordinarily difficult without any shared language, and then led that human through an unfamiliar forest. That was not a small thing for any creature to do. He had expected exhaustion to take over eventually and for the little one to curl up somewhere and close its eyes. It did not. It stayed pressed against its parents' side through the afternoon and into the evening, and when Samuel looked up from his work, it was always looking back at him. Not with anxiety anymore. The desperate, frightened look from the morning had changed into something different. Steadier. More settled. It was watching him the way you watch someone you have decided to trust, not because you have proof yet, but because something in you has made a decision and is holding to it. Samuel found that look difficult to carry and important at the same time. He did not want to let it down. As the light in the forest faded and the temperature dropped, Samuel added a little more wood to the fire and pulled his coat tighter. The sounds of the forest changed at night. The things that moved in the high branches were different from the daytime ones. Somewhere far off, something called out in a long, echoing sound that had no equivalent he could think of. The silver trees caught the firelight and turned its strange colors at their edges. He was not afraid. He was too focused to be afraid. Every hour or so he prepared a fresh amount of the mixture, adjusting it slightly each time, a little more of one herb, a little less of another, based on how the large drake was responding. He had learned this kind of adjustment in his cooking. You tasted, you observed, you changed what needed changing. You did not follow a recipe so rigidly that you missed what was actually in front of you. The drake was in front of him. He paid attention to it. Around the middle of the night, something shifted. The large drake's breathing changed. Not dramatically, Samuel would have missed it if he had not been listening so carefully. But the pattern became more regular. The long, uneven pauses between breaths grew shorter. The rattle that had been present in every exhale since he had arrived became quieter, less present, more like an echo of itself than the thing itself. Samuel sat up straighter. He prepared the next round of the mixture with extra care, taking his time, making sure everything was right. When he brought it to the large drake, he noticed that its nostrils moved more actively than before, smelling, processing, responding. That was new. That was good. The tiny drake noticed it too. It lifted its small head and made a sound Samuel had not heard from it before. Short and clear and different in quality from anything it had produced all day. Not a distress sound. Something else. Something that made the hair on Samuel's arms stand up slightly, though he could not have explained why. He offered the mixture. The large drake took it more readily this time. Samuel sat back and watched and waited and let the hours pass. He thought about his kitchen. He thought about the 30 people at the outpost who would be wondering where their cook had gone. He thought about the morning tea he had never finished, still sitting cold on the back step. He thought about the bundle of greens the tiny drake had carried so carefully through the forest and placed at his feet, and he thought about what kind of mind plans something like that, what kind of mind looks at a problem, thinks about what is needed, and then goes and finds the one thing that might help. A good mind, he decided. A very good mind in a very small body. The night moved on. Samuel dozed once, briefly, sitting upright with his back against the tree beside the hollow. He woke quickly, checked the fire, checked the large drake, and found everything as it should be. The tiny drake was looking at him. He nodded at it. It held his gaze for a moment and then looked back at its parent. The sky above the forest canopy began to change. It happened gradually, the way dawns always do. First a softening of the darkness, then a slow, gray light that filtered down through the high leaves and touched the clearing without committing to anything yet. Then, little by little, color returned to the world. The silver trees became themselves again. The ground came back into focus. Samuel had been watching the large drake's face. So he saw it happen. First, a tightening around the eyes, a small muscular change, barely visible, but there. Then a stillness that was different from unconsciousness, the stillness of something gathering itself. Then, slowly, with great effort, the large drake's eyes opened. They were amber. Deeper and darker than the tiny ones, but the same quality of light in them. They opened and they focused and they found Samuel's face and they stayed there. Samuel did not move. He did not speak. He sat completely still and let the large drake look at him for as long as it needed to. The tiny drake made that sound again, the short, clear one from the middle of the night. This time Samuel was almost certain he understood what it meant. Samuel did not move for a long time. He sat beside the hollow and watched the large drake breathe. Each breath was slow and full and even, nothing like the rattling, broken rhythm from the day before. The gray morning light came down through the canopy and touched the creature's scales, and Samuel could already see the difference. The dullness was not completely gone yet, but something underneath it had returned. A faint, deep quality, like a fire that had nearly gone out but had caught again and was rebuilding itself quietly. The large drake's amber eyes stayed open. They moved slowly around the clearing, taking things in, the trees, the fire, the cup, the field kit open on the ground. Then they came back to Samuel and stayed there. There was nothing frightened in that gaze. Nothing aggressive. There was something else, something that Samuel had no clean word for, something between recognition and consideration, the look of a thinking creature deciding what it understood about what had happened. Samuel stayed still and let it look. The tiny drake was on its feet now. It was moving around its parent in small, quick circles, making sounds that were higher and faster than anything Samuel had heard from it before. Sounds that carried something bright in them, something that did not need translation. It pressed its small head against the large one's jaw. It pushed its nose under the large drake's chin. The large drake made a low sound in return, deep and resonant, and turned its head slowly to rest against the tiny one for a moment. Samuel looked away. It felt like something private. Something he should give them space for. He cleaned up his work quietly. He put the metal cup away, folded the cloths, closed the pouches of herbs, and packed everything back into his field kit. He put out the fire carefully, making sure every ember was cold before he left it. He did these things slowly and without fuss, keeping his movements small and his presence as unobtrusive as possible. When he was done, he stood up and put the kit over his shoulder. He looked at the large drake one more time. It had shifted inside the hollow, pulling itself more upright, getting its front legs properly beneath it. It was not standing yet, but it was close. The strength was coming back. Samuel could see it returning with each passing minute, the way strength always returns to a body that has been given what it needs. He gave a small nod, more to himself than to anyone else, and turned to go. He had taken perhaps 4 steps when he heard a sound behind him. He turned. The large drake was standing. It had pulled itself fully upright inside the hollow, and now it stepped forward slowly, out of the shelter of the roots and into the open clearing. It was taller than Samuel had realized. Standing, it came up to his chest. Its wings shifted slightly at its sides, not opening, just moving, the way a person might adjust their shoulders. Its scales in the full morning light were beginning to show their proper color again. A deep, rich green that had been buried under the grayness of the past days and was now coming back to the surface. It walked toward him. Samuel stood completely still. The large drake stopped 2 steps away from him. It looked at him steadily for a long moment, and Samuel looked back, and neither of them moved. Then the large drake did something that Samuel had not expected and would not forget for the rest of his life. It lowered its head. Not a small dip. A full, slow, deliberate lowering, the great head coming down and down until the front of it nearly touched the ground at Samuel's feet. It held that position. Still and quiet and completely clear in its meaning. Samuel heard a small sound to his left. The tiny drake had come to stand beside him. And it was doing exactly the same thing, its small head lowered to the ground, its body still, its tail flat, mirroring its parent with the seriousness of a creature that understood completely what this gesture meant and wanted to be part of it. Samuel stood between them, a middle-aged cook from a small outpost at the edge of an alien forest, with his old field kit over his shoulder and his coat still damp from the night, and he felt something move through his chest that he did not try to name. He lowered his own head. It seemed like the right thing to do. They stayed like that for a few seconds, the 3 of them, in the quiet clearing, in the morning light, and then the large drake raised its head and stepped back toward the hollow. Samuel raised his head too. The tiny drake straightened up and looked at him with those amber eyes, and then it did something new. It walked to him, stood at his feet, and placed one small claw on top of his boot. Just for a moment. Then it stepped back and went to its parent. Samuel walked home through the silver forest alone. It took him longer without the drake to guide him, and he took 2 wrong turns before he found the familiar smell of the outpost machinery and followed it back to the tree line. He came out of the forest at the back of the kitchen, crossed the flat stone step, went inside, and put the kettle on. Nobody had noticed he was gone. Or if they had, nobody asked. He made his tea, stood at the back door, and looked at the trees. 3 days later, the first gift appeared. It was there when he opened the back door in the morning, a small bundle of dark berries, placed neatly on the stone step. They were not a variety he recognized, but they smelled clean and good, and when he examined them carefully he was confident they were safe. He used them in the evening meal that night. Everyone said the dessert was the best he had made in months. After that, the gifts came regularly. Not every day at first. Every 2 or 3 days. Then more often. Always in the morning, always on the back step, always chosen with obvious care. Fresh fruits that were rare and beautiful. Bundles of herbs he had never been able to source. Small smooth stones that caught light in unusual ways. Once, a single large feather, deep green, that could only have come from the large drake itself. Samuel kept that one. He set it on the windowsill of his kitchen where the morning light could find it. The tiny drake started visiting in person. It would appear at the back door around the time Samuel opened it each morning, as if it had learned his schedule, which perhaps it had. It would sit on the step while he drank his tea, and he would break off a piece of whatever he had baked that morning and set it beside the water dish he now kept out permanently. Sometimes it stayed a short while. Sometimes it stayed for hours, watching him work through the kitchen window, a small pale green shape sitting perfectly still on the stone step. The researchers at the outpost noticed eventually. They asked Samuel many questions. He answered them simply and without drama, because there was no drama in it, as far as he was concerned. He had found a creature that needed help. He had helped it. That was all. But it was not all, and somewhere underneath his practical nature, Samuel knew that. Something had started in that clearing. Something quiet and unplanned and real. Built not from treaties or research or any deliberate attempt at connection, but from a small creature carrying a bundle of greens to a back door, and a man who had decided, without overthinking it, to follow where it led. He never stopped leaving water on the step each evening. And the tiny drake never stopped coming back.